Welcome back to Ryan Rambles. I'm Ryan, and apologies if I sound a little bit under the weather. I feel fine, sound weird, but I'm not going to let it stop me from continuing my Moon Knight run of episodes here. I've been saying I've read 40 years worth of Moon Knight comics. Turns out it's darn near 50. Actually, Moon Knight came out in Werewolf by Night number 32 in August 1975. So coming up on the 50-year anniversary, actually. So arguably should have saved all these episodes for next year if I was concerned about that type of thing. But what if I just remind you all that they exist at that point? So this week we're doing episode 3 of the TV show. It's titled The Friendly Type, and if I were to look at IMDb, it has a little blurb that says, with Mark in the forefront and Harrow ahead, Mark and Layla navigate Cairo for intel. So, yeah, we actually, up top, start with Layla at the beginning of the episode, but also when we get to Mark Spector, and it is Mark Spector, he's in the driver's seat as far as the multiple personality disorder goes. Stephen Grant is the blank space now, which, if you've been watching, the way they kind of surface this is by way of missed time. You know, like he'll pop up in the middle of stuff and it'll be because he was Stephen Grant for a period. For the entire series so far, we've been doing that with Mark Spector. Mark Spector has been kind of the blank space. But what the description means by Harrow's ahead is that Arthur Harrow, the big bad Ethan Hawke's character, has apparently found Ammit's tomb, which is the thing he's been looking for. I don't know if I've mentioned this. This is kind of the thing that's hanging over the entire series, is something we want to prevent, but also by way of this scarab, which has pretty much been the MacGuffin for the series so far that I also probably haven't mentioned. It's just this compass of sorts that is supposedly leading whoever has it to the tomb, to Ammit's tomb. So I don't actually want to get that plot heavy, which is probably why I haven't mentioned it in past episodes. I try to avoid just doing a rundown of, and then this happened, and then this happened, unless it relates to something I want to actually talk about. And this week, I probably will want to talk about the plot somewhat, because I guess, spoiler, not my favorite. And overall, the episode, not my favorite so far. Not going to hate it. It's not horrible, but if I'm going to put these on a scale so far, everything else has been above it. But I'll talk why later. I do want to lead with what I did like. And in all of the switching, like I mentioned, Mark, Steven, maybe Moon Knight. It's funny, in some of the comics, they do treat Moon Knight as his own complete other alter. They're definitely not going for that here. In fact, the way they've done it is Moon Knight is different based on who's in charge. In fact, that's how they decided to surface the Mr. Knight costume, which I really loved. But the structural choice, like I mentioned, that they've done of kind of when the other's in charge, it can just manifest as blank space. Like we come back in the middle and it's like, what happened? I'd actually really love, because it puts us in the shoes of whoever our protagonist is at the time. And I'm watching, I guess, I don't know how this would actually relate, but I'm watching Aces Go Places 4 for cinematic this week. And one of the issues with that actual film is that they do change protagonists, but without really any work to put you in the shoes. And that's a very different movie. But when it comes to using a protagonist to bring the viewer into the story you're trying to tell, obviously you can shoot yourself in the foot if you're switching protagonists halfway through, which is why a lot of things don't do that. So the fact that they're doing that in Moon Knight, technically, but coming up with these ways, again, structurally, this idea that when the alter that we're not concerned with is in charge, we just don't see it, kind of actually puts us into the story of who is in charge a little bit more easily, I think. So I do like that, and I do think they're using it wonderfully, because I also think that this show so far is at its best when it's creating mysteries. And where these two things literally collide is in one, I think. So he's searching out these guys that are going to tell him where this other guy is, and there's a blackout, and he comes to with, like, as Mark Spector, again, Stephen Grant being the blank space, with a knife in one of the guys. And he's like, oh no, Stephen, what did you do? And Stephen's like, this wasn't me. So in the process, we've introduced a third kind of like, oh, who was it then? And Stephen kind of points at Khonshu, but he hasn't been a true alter either in the series so far. He just kind of manifests as figments, or I guess he is actually real. There's kind of no question mark unless they want to do some real fun stuff for the back half of this series. But so far, Khonshu is real. No, he's real. Like if they go that crazy, I'm going to call BS, because by the end of this episode, Khonshu is affecting things that entire cities can observe. So let's say Khonshu is real. Also, there's the Council of Gods I'm going to get to. So Khonshu is real, but not everybody can see him. So maybe actually what I'm getting closer to is that I think the series, in fact, a lot of series are a little bit weaker when it comes to answering those questions. You know, how many times have we watched something that set up just a wonderful story or something that's gone wild in our imagination, and then when it gets to them having to really answer it, when they decide to, this is why maybe I like it when there are some open-ended stories, but when series decide to start answering questions, it's a little less satisfying, let's say. So this isn't alone in that. And there's always the chance that I just straight up miss some stuff. In fact, kind of betting on that, I went back and watched this a second time. So yes, I might be dumb, but also there might be some issues. And I did watch the episode twice just to make sure. So the big thing, honestly, I'll just get right to it when it comes to the story and how it was told in this particular episode. So Khonshu is on the outs with a god council of sorts, and each kind of Egyptian god has their own avatar. Also, apparently Khonshu's avatar, which has been Mark, or I think Mark mostly, but also now Stephen from time to time, because, and I don't know if this is something that's like ever been directly answered or treated or really spelled out in kind of order of operations type way, but you get the feeling that Khonshu chose Mark as his avatar, not necessarily knowing that Mark himself was broken, was somebody with dissociative identity disorder, multiple personality disorder, whatever. So that's a pretty cool tension. Maybe, in fact, that's probably what I'm having a hard time remembering if it has been like expressly treated in the comics, because all of it has been to some extent. But this idea that Khonshu chose somebody broken to be his avatar, whether on purpose or otherwise, and that there's kind of a working out of the situation that needs to happen because of it, and still in the interest of Mark Spector, in the interest of somebody who is broken in a way. And I kind of do see shades of that actually in this episode that I really like, especially by the end when Khonshu does something almost selfless in a way. But before I blow past my issues with the entire thing, so Khonshu is on the outs with the other gods, and they have this council where all the avatars come, and Khonshu essentially makes his case against Arthur Harrow, who, by the way, has used that little scarab MacGuffin to find Amit's tomb, supposedly, like, she's here, is what he says to numerous people, and they start digging, and then Khonshu makes his accusation against Harrow that's like he's trying to recover Amit's tomb, and this is like expressly forbidden among the Council of Gods, which I guess Amit's going to be one of the gods that they banished for dark reasons. So the idea that somebody would be attempting to dig her up is an issue, but when Khonshu makes the accusation and they summon Arthur Harrow, Harrow's like, no, I'm not. Or he might even say something along the lines of, is digging in the desert a crime or something like that? And they completely side with him at that point. And I'm like, is there like no, somebody could have just gone and looked option? So that seemed a little strange at first. They, after the fact, they completely dismiss the whole thing. Everybody takes off. One of the avatars stays with Mark and is like, there's another way. And then she explains that the gods don't know where Amit is buried because it just, it would have been too dangerous or whatever. Could have used that information maybe beforehand, but still it seems like they really took Harrow's word for it a little too quickly, unless, and given what happens at the end of the episode also, Harrow is somehow in league, or they're somehow in league with Harrow. I don't know. So they could fix this later on for sure. but within the confines of this particular episode, at that point, I was a little, okay. The rest of the episode is basically them following that lead from the other avatar to kind of track down the location of Amit's tomb without the scarab, which, yes, I have another question then. Did the scarab not lead them to Amit's tomb? This is probably why I shouldn't get too caught up in this stuff, because some of you that have seen this series that came out several years ago are yelling at whatever device you're listening to this on right now. So they get to it's a sarcophagus that has a map that leads to Amit's tomb deal. They get to that sarcophagus. Harrow shows up as well, and there's an action sequence which this might have suffered the most from my first round of viewing. And I will say, this needs to be like a permanent caveat for me. Those of you that have seen the cinematic series that I'm doing, I've been watching a lot of the best action movies of all time for quite some time now. So I could be hypercritical about this type of stuff. And honestly, the first time around when I saw this action sequence, I was like, I didn't really enjoy it. The second time around, I was like, okay, I might have just been a little bit stodgy around there because of the other movies that I have been watching. It's good. The choreography isn't necessarily up to snuff of like literally anything else I've been watching, but they have some wonderful imagery about it. We get throughout the Moon Knight comics, there has been this, he jumps down from any height and his cape billows into the form of a moon. And pretty much anytime any artist has done it, it's been really cool looking. So they get one of those in here during this fight, along with a few other things that are very, very cool. I think I was just hung up on the choreography maybe right off the bat. So nothing as complicated as a Hong Kong action movie, you could say. And this is right on the heels of, again, some of that plot stuff that I was less than jazzed with. Like I mentioned, again, if Harrow's there, what was the deal with the scarab in the first place? Did it not? Like that is stuff that they do need to answer. I don't care if it's in a later episode, but if they're just like never decide to explain why he needed the map and the scarab, that would be a straight up plot hole. But by the end of the episode, the thing I talked about Khonshu doing that I thought was fairly interesting, especially given a little bit of what we talked about last week with Khonshu and how he can be a bit of a question mark. He's not an all-powerful god. He's quite possibly a petulant one at that, which I guess isn't a new trope necessarily. But like early on when, in fact, that bit where Mark Spector comes back into control and has the knife in somebody, he's like, Steven, what did you do? Khonshu does appear, and Khonshu's like, hang this dude. They're on a cliff top because they needed a cliff top. So Khonshu's like, hang him over the edge. He'll talk. So Spector goes and hangs him over the edge. Instead of him talking, he cuts the thing that Spector is holding him by and falls to his death. Basically, commits suicide for his god. And Khonshu is just like, oh, I thought he'd talk. So Khonshu, not flawless by any means, and also it seems quite callous in others. But by the end, when they have that map put together, which Mark needed to relent to Steven to get it put together, that's kind of the tension there, is that Steven has this knowledge of Egypt to further the story, I guess. But they use it well. I'm being glib at this point. They need to basically change the night sky to read this star map that they've put together. And Khonshu's like, I can do it, but there will be a price. So Khonshu does it with the help of Steven, actually, as Moon Knight, so as Mr. Knight here. And because of it, is immediately imprisoned in stone, like the gods threatened they would do if Khonshu didn't behave, more or less. So by the end of that episode, and again, kind of sweetly, really is the way it's played, sacrifices himself for the greater good. It may be. I guess we'll find out. I might be bringing a little bit more. I bet within the confines of this show, like that is a legit concern. Obviously, we don't want Ammit. Obviously, Ethan Hawke's character is a bad guy. Like, I think all that is going to be true. I don't think by the end we're going to find out that Khonshu was the big bad guy all along or anything like that. But who knows? I am still at that point in the series where I feel like anything could happen, and I think they've done the work for me to feel like that. So in that way, the series is still doing well, even if this is my least favorite episode so far. I do also think that they really are taking advantage of the medium. the episodic 40-minute episode medium here, as opposed to we had an idea for a movie and we just put a bunch of filler in there until it was 6 episodes or whatever. So I do think they are taking advantage of what they have here, and I'm curious to see what they do with all of it. So we'll see. I've recently been going back and reading up again. Yes, some Moon Knight comics, in fact, because when I started doing the reading, it was in it was maybe the end of 2022. No, it was probably 2022, actually, when I heard the show was coming out. But at some point, I stopped keeping up. So I stopped actually reading the comics, I think sometime in 2023, as far as the comics that were coming out. So turns out there are some developments that maybe I wasn't considering. Like when I mentioned that, because Arthur Harrow is like an ex-avatar of Khonshu. When I mentioned like that, I didn't remember that being a thing from the comics specifically. The only way it does surface sometimes is that, it is in this most current run, or maybe just the version 9 run of Moon Knight, that they do some no, you know what it is? So I went back and reread some of the stuff that I had read also, because I was having a hard time remembering some of it. And there was an Age of Khonshu storyline in a recent Avengers book, like barely a year ago, maybe 2, where Khonshu kind of tries to take over the world in the interest of defending it from some incursion that actually doesn't happen during the Age of Khonshu. The art is really good. The story is kind of really good, but it's not a one-off. Like, it's very much in the service of some other thing they had going on that I don't know how it ended or whatever. So there's that part of it that I'm like, well, you didn't tell an entire story. It was more of, well, what if on the way we also do this with Khonshu? Wouldn't that be interesting? Yeah, it would be, but a little unsatisfying maybe by the end. Anyway, at one point they have because Khonshu has taken charge and he's taken he's taken the Sorcerer Supreme power. It's during a supermoon, so he has more power than usual and is able to take Thor's hammer, even because supposedly it's made of moon rock, even if inside it does contain a storm. That's been part of go look up Mjolnir. But in telling some of that history, they show a league of old avatars of Khonshu. So there's this idea that has been a thing in the past, but we don't spend any time with anyone in particular. There hasn't been a real story rival to Mark Spector's Moon Knight until I kept reading some of those issues of version 9. And the guy I did mention that was there was a wannabe was Dr. Bader, who is this follower, disciple of Khonshu, but they didn't ever expand on his story in the issues I read to let me know that he was an actual fist of Khonshu, like Moon Knight is a fist of Khonshu. Well, in some of the later issues that I'm now reading, yeah, pretty much. In fact, he has kind of the same story, is that he, I believe, died and was brought back to life by Khonshu as well, which is Mark Spector's exact story. So puts him on more of the same footing as Moon Knight himself. But part of the strength of that book, which it didn't make any of my honorable mentions or my top 10 from those 2 video episodes I did. So kind of repenting on that one a little bit. I've found new love for that particular series in some very cool ways, and we'll keep going because there's some character crossover, which is what I'm kind of getting to. So not really prepared to speak about that or anything I just spoke about, for that matter. So we'll save that for later and keep it maybe a little attached to these TV episodes, which we'll be doing episode 4 next time. So come back for that. Thanks for hanging out for this. As always, you can find me on patreon.com/Ryan_runs_ if you want to contribute and help me do some of this stuff. Again, I'm trying to make this my going concern, and it's easier when other people help me, let's say. So if you didn't like this, you might check out every Wednesday at 8 Chasers, which is also comic book related. My daughter Evelyn and I are going through some packs of Marvel Universe cards from 1994, kind of digging into some of that current mythology as well. Those packs of cards, those series of cards were often snapshots of the universe at that time, which is part of what makes them interesting. So doing some of that. And then every Friday, like I mentioned, at 8, there will be a new episode of Cinematic, which this week will be Aces Go Places. And wow, if you haven't tuned in for any of these so far, maybe give that one a shot. This movie was wild in so many ways. Really got to check it out. So failing any of that, you can catch me live. Come and talk to me, chat to me live in real time every Tuesday at 10 when I play a new Tetris game. Obviously more on the video game side of things. So either way, thanks again. And thanks especially to the people that have signed up, that do make this possible. Thank you always. We'll see you next time.